This is part 2 of Adam Walks Around, episode 47, Ewasko's Last Trail, and a follow-up to episode 36, Joshua Tree Mystery. In this show, we will attempt to reconstruct the events leading to hiker Bill Ewasko's disappearance after visiting the site where he was found. We wish to thank the Missing Enigma web series and especially otherhand.org for extensively sharing pictures, maps, and other information. We also reached out to the San Bernardino County Sheriff and Coroner's offices for additional information and corroboration. If and when that becomes available, we will post an update.
So if Bill's phone had pinged here, then it would have been just after sunrise or just at sunrise. It would have looked very much like this. What would you have done? This is what you would have been looking at if this was where you were.
After 3 years of failed searches and multiple discarded theories, I was finally asking the right question. Unfortunately, it would be 6 more years before we had an answer.
This is the point where Bill made a fateful decision. If he'd continued up this wash, within a mile he would have had reliable cell reception, and within about 3 miles he would have hit the southernmost houses from Joshua Tree Village. Straight shot down the wash, easy terrain. But the sun would have been coming up, or it would have been early morning. He would have seen no shade in what appeared to be a vast wasteland with no hope of rescue. So he decided to circle back up into the mountains.
As we proceed on this hike, remember that my narration here reflects my understanding as of April 2022. As we'll see, what we found at the site, plus information acquired later, will significantly alter that understanding. So we're moving up towards the canyon, away from Quail Wash, and Jen just got reception on her phone. I didn't get any, but we both got Verizon. This is another place that Bill's phone might have gone off, is where we're at. It was probably either where we're standing or near here or down where we were earlier at the mouth of Smithwater Canyon. This is a good time to be more specific about the site of Bill's cell phone ping. For simplicity's sake, in part 1, I pegged the location as the mouth of Smithwater Canyon emptying into Quail Wash. Actually, that is one of 3 possibilities in the same area. Reception models indicate Bill's phone could have gone off at the mouth of the canyon we looked at in part 1, and while it is not shown on these same models, I got reliable Verizon reception on multiple occasions at the mouth of Smithwater Canyon in 2013 and 2014, and topographically, the clearest signal path would have been to the same tower. Both these locations make sense as, depending on which canyon Bill came through, it's logical that he might have turned on his phone once he cleared the canyon walls. The third location is here, where Jen's phone went off, along the wash where Bill must have traveled to where he was eventually found. This location makes sense if, as Tom Mahood theorizes, Bill might have missed the spot at the mouth of Smithwater Canyon but inadvertently left his phone on and didn't notice the connection. We'll talk more about this when we get to the theories. But either way, Bill was right around here Sunday morning, early morning, going up there. So now we're in the wash where I believe the Mary Trail goes these days, but back in 2010 it was unmarked. And it is almost certain that Bill took this way up, probably hoping to get a line of sight from the top of these mountains to see something other than what he had seen on his previous 2 tries, which is vast stretches of desert wasteland. And we're going to see what happened next. These trail marker signs are only about 5 years old. Bill wouldn't have had them to guide him over the ridge. Clear terrain, but this would have been a long slog. At this point, despite the lack of markings at the time, Bill would have had a trail to follow, and if he could have stayed on it, he could have made it to safety.
In my last search for Bill, a short distance north of this spot, I took note of a similar appearing and disappearing trail along my path of travel in my notes for the day. Though I flagged the area for further exploration, I had no way of knowing that the answer to Bill's fate lay with a similar vanishing path in the very next canyon.
This is where things finally went fatally wrong for Bill. Now, there's a sign to show you that the Mary Trail leaves the wash, goes up over the saddle to Park Road into safety. If Bill had turned right here, he probably would have been safe.
As we've already seen, while the panorama and Mary trails between which Bill's remains were found are shown on maps as established routes, they have only been recently marked. When Bill came this way, and indeed years later when I did, they were more aspirational ideas than real cross-country pathways. In a weakened condition and likely walking into the morning sunlight, Bill missed the reappearance of the Mary Trail rising from the wash, heading over the ridge to more established trails and eventually to safety. It wouldn't have been hard to do, because as we can see from this comparison of aerial photographs in 2011 and 2021, the trail out of the wash was much less well defined when Bill encountered it.
And Bill, unquestionably dehydrated, weakened, continued up the wash. So will we. What's extraordinary about this is, though it seems Bill must have been injured for him to have been out this long, he had to have been able-bodied enough, not just to get up here, but get up obstructions like that rock wall. I mean, you know, it's not like it's climbing Mount Everest, but that would have been hard, especially because no walking stick, as far as we know, found with his remains.
I was surprised how many barriers a supposedly injured Bill had to clear to get up the wash, and it began to make me uncertain as to where he got out. Since we were using a primitive GPS and a paper map to find our way to where Bill was discovered, we climbed out of the wash up to the ridge to get a vantage point and ensure we could locate the circle of rocks where hikers found Bill's remains.
Yeah, just 50 feet above the wash. Assuming it was in condition to see it, Park Road and the cars would have been visible in the distance.
What kind of Indiana Jones shit did you take me on?
Come on there, Indy.
God, I'm in way better shape than I knew.
Yeah, me too.
Man.
Seeing as I'm a man of an uncertain age.
I climbed up that with Adam Marsland and everywhere.
What are you gonna do?
Woo! That was intense. It's just really sad once you're here because you realize all the fear and anxiety that he was going through on this climb, completely alone and in who knows what kind of pain. Like, we're here doing this and we feel good, we're hydrated, we're together. We haven't been at it for days, we know where we are. But having no sense of direction at this point after struggling, it's just really sad.
Yeah, all these years, you know, looking for the guy. I get a little detached, you know, because you're trying to solve a puzzle, you know, but
it's heartbreaking.
It is. You know, I mean, I'm fairly convinced for the last 3 hours we've been following the path he took, and it's just tragic. Well, we're only 50 feet away from where Bill passed. It appears that Bill followed this wash up to about this point and then realized he was heading nowhere once again. So he did a final heroic climb straight up this rock face. He went straight up that. It's unbelievable.
see Tom's footprints when he was here. Small circle of rocks. There it is.
Yeah, we're almost right on it.
Yeah, that's it. You can turn it off.
Stuff into the right.
I know. This is it. This sucks.
For many years, my focus had been on unraveling a mystery. Now I was overwhelmed by the stark reality of a human tragedy in an environment that was equally stark. But I still had one last bit of detective work: to search for any makeshift walking stick that an injured Bill must have had to make it this far. But in the spot where it should have lain, there was only more desert. Neither I, nor Tom, nor the people that found Bill saw any trace of any such implement in an area where long straight branches or anything similar are rare and should have stuck out like a sore thumb.
Bill followed the wash all the way up to this point, then went straight up this slope to a place that would have afforded him the best possible shade, this circle of rocks.
After we searched Bill's final resting place, it was time to descend back down to the wash and go back over his last steps for anything else we could find.
There's little indentations there in the sand. I mean, it might just be animal tracks. Even after 12 years, there might be some trace. Look at those 4 little indentations there. You see them?
Mm-hmm.
Wonder what that is.
Oh, a rabbit or something.
Bill apparently followed the trail to this point where he would have seen a wall of mountains. He then climbed straight up this slope. Tragic situation.
The last stretch of the wash, which we had skipped when we climbed out early to get our bearings, was fairly easy terrain, but again with a surprising number of obstructions that should have been problematic for an injured person without a walking aid.
A rare sighting of a desert tortoise. Hi, sweetheart. Hi.
You can go in front.
I mean, I know how desert tortoises are. So, hi, buddy. Hi. How's it going? You winking at me? What's up? You got a nice face.
The California desert is a place that sustains life and offers beauty in unexpected places. For William Michael Ewasko, his journey of adventure also ended in an unexpected place. While there is nothing mysterious about the passing of a hiker after 3 days in the summer desert heat, based on what we know of his plans, this should never have happened. So not just to satisfy our own curiosity, but out of respect for Bill's courageous effort to save himself and for the benefit of future hikers who will walk solo into the wilderness, we'll now put forth our best theories as to how and why he got to this desolate spot, based on what we now know, can deduce, and on our most educated guesses. As we explore these possibilities, keep in mind that any event is the product of many different decisions and environmental factors impossible to fully reconstruct. While we can narrow down to the most probable scenarios, without more to go on, none is likely to be 100% correct. Longtime followers of this mystery will remember that there were inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts of whether and in what position Bill's car was parked at the trailhead during the days following his disappearance, a factor that contributed to suspicions that it was staged or that foul play was involved. However, even then, attempts to reconcile these accounts with one another resulted in some pretty far-fetched scenarios. With the discovery of Bill's remains, you'd have to reach even farther than that for an explanation. For me, absent any evidence of something really weird going on, I'm chalking this up to another example of the unreliability of eyewitness statements, and assuming that Bill's car was never moved from the time it was parked by Bill at some point on Thursday. This brings us to important new information. What the site of Bill's remains and what was found there can add to our understanding of what happened. Here, I need to offer thanks to the Missing Enigma YouTube series, who generously shared the Joshua Tree National Park incident report for the recovery and its accompanying pictures with us, and also Bill Bocrobe, one of the hiking party that discovered Bill's remains, who answered my questions about what he saw at the site. I also want to again acknowledge the full cooperation of Tom Mahood, the force behind the crowdsourced effort to find Bill and the most knowledgeable individual of the case and of the topography of the area. Tom has offered ideas, information, and constructive criticism freely, and as I present our theories, keep in mind that while we've both got a lot of time on this case, his engagement dwarfs my own. The biggest surprise in the incident report was that Bill was carrying a Camelback, or portable hydration pack, on his hike. This, at last, answers the question of how Bill could have survived for 3 days with only 2 12-ounce bottles of water. Now we know that those bottles, one of which was found at the scene, were only his reserve, and he was already carrying 2 or 3 liters on his back. This means Bill left on his hike with an adequate water supply to climb Quail Mountain and return if that was his destination. This also means that if Bill decided to continue north to Smithwater Canyon, it wasn't because he was out of water, as has been theorized. We can also be fairly certain that Bill arrived at the site on Sunday morning not too long after his cell phone went off. This is because the rock walls behind which Bill lay faced the sunrise and only would have provided shade during the morning hours. While it was not that hot on Sunday, reaching about 87 degrees Fahrenheit, direct sunlight still would have been an issue, and if Bill had been there longer, he would be expected to shift positions to find shade. We can also be certain of Bill's path to the site because his binoculars were found a few hundred feet downslope from where his remains were found, under a small shrub facing westward, again implying that Bill had rested there while making the climb and took advantage of the shadow cast by the morning sun in the east. The binoculars being left behind suggest a weakened physical and mental condition as Bill made the final push to get up the slope. We can also be sure that Bill had not been at the site for long, because if he had looked over the rock walls, he should have been able to see Park Road and the passing traffic just a mile away. And yet, he never went back for his binoculars, and even if he was incapacitated, the survival whistle he carried was found still in his pack, unused, indicating that once he arrived at the circle of rocks, he collapsed and made no further progress or attempt at rescue. Indeed, the scene suggests Bill never even looked over the rock wall, although, as we'll see later, there is a strong possibility he knew exactly where he was and how close to the road he had to be. But for me, perhaps the most significant thing was what wasn't found at the site. Any staff, branch, or other implement Bill could have fashioned into a walking stick. I didn't find one, nor did Tom Mahood, nor the people that discovered his remains. The incident report doesn't mention removing one, nor is there a picture of one in the report, which would be expected if it was taken away for evidence. Both Tom and I agree, this is weird. Moreover, as we made our way back that night, one thought kept nagging at me. Retracing Bill's last steps up the wash to the top of the ridge, I could feel a sense of determination to reach a goal, the kind of dogged pushing forward of someone fighting for their life. But with its relentless uphill path followed by climbs over dry waterfalls and around plant obstructions, this felt like a path taken by an impaired, exhausted, but still able-bodied person. And speaking as someone who not long ago broke their own ankle, there is simply no way I can imagine Bill having made this journey injured without some kind of walking aid. And yet, nowhere along that path nor at the site of his remains could I see any discarded object that could have served as one, and apparently neither did anyone else. Why is this significant? Remember that one of the most puzzling aspects of this case was that Bill's phone did not go off from the time he disappeared sometime Thursday afternoon until early Sunday morning. Assuming he went north from the Quail Mountain area, there should have been cell reception most of the way, which means that Bill would have been confined to a relatively small area along one of his two likely paths of travel for more than 2 days, which suggested he probably became incapacitated by injury in that spot and could not go back the way he came. That's what we all assumed. And yet, the place where Bill's remains were found was 3 miles from the nearest dangerous terrain. Moreover, he would have traveled uphill at least half a mile, and possibly as much as 2 miles from the place his cell went off to the place he was found, probably just in the space of a few hours on Sunday morning. While that is not a fast rate of travel, it is far faster than someone could crawl. I began to ask myself, was it possible that, while impaired by dehydration and exhaustion, Bill was never actually injured? As of the release of this video, we've been unable to obtain the coroner's report to answer this question. For what it's worth, leaked photos from the scene show a seemingly intact leg bone, and Bill Bocrobe did not see any signs of fractures on the remains. If Bill was uninjured, then how was he seemingly immobilized for more than 2 days? Could Bill have had a transitory health event, a minor heart attack or stroke, a twisted ankle, or perhaps a fall down a pit or a cliff face he could not climb back from that took him 2 days to recover from? Yes, perhaps, but these do not explain the other big mystery, which is why Bill would have moved substantially past Quail Mountain into a cell dead zone far away from his car in the first place. Is it further possible that during this time Bill became disoriented and no longer knew exactly where he was? Yes, but is it likely? Here, the original 2010 incident reports, combined with the location of his remains, may offer more clues. When I walked Bill's presumed routes last April, I was assuming that he was disoriented and unsure of his location. After all, he had strangely foregone 2 easy, level paths to safety in favor of an uphill climb into uncertainty. And the idea of a hiker confused and disoriented after 2.5 waterless days in the desert intuitively makes sense. But on reflection, does it really make any sense? After all, if Bill had somehow gotten stuck north of Quail Mountain, he hadn't really gone anywhere. If he'd stayed in the shade and conserved his water, he might not even be in that bad shape. And if Bill had made the unlikely decision to move in that direction, you would assume he'd do it with some sense of the area. Moreover, Bill was a map guy. We know this because rangers who went to his rented condo looking for clues found it full of maps and lists of potential places to visit. He also seems to have had a compass attached to his survival whistle that appears to show signs of recent use. The odds, then, are very high Bill had a compass and a map, perhaps several maps. But which ones? Buried in the original report is a hint that Bill may have had the Indian Cove and Keys View topographical maps. Keys View would have shown most, but not all, of the route to Quail Mountain from Bill's car, as well as his presumed earlier destination, Lost Horse Mine. It's very possible he had this map. Indian Cove shows the rest of the ascent to Quail Mountain and would have clearly shown the way out if Bill had come up the Quail Springs Canyon that we examined in Part 1, but not if he had come out of Smith Water Canyon. Since it's unlikely Bill had any other maps to the west, that means either he didn't have it, or if he came down Smith Water Canyon, he had it, but it didn't matter. So for our purposes, it doesn't matter either. However, we know Bill had many destinations in mind for Joshua Tree National Park and may have been undecided about his itinerary on that first day. Therefore, it makes even more sense that he would have had an overall map of the park. It's almost certain he had the standard visitor map that comes with entry to the park, but Bill likely would have wanted a more detailed, comprehensive map including most of the trails and points of interest for overall reference and to plan his hiking. Tom Mahood believes, and I agree, the most likely candidate is the Joshua Tree map produced by cartographer Tom Harrison, which is sold locally and comes in durable folding plastic coating ideal to carry on a hike. The Harrison map is probably the most detailed overall map of the park, showing most of the trails, points of interest, and topography. However, it is a handmade, highly stylized map meant for use as a detailed overview, not as a precise on-the-ground navigational tool. That said, said, there is a very good chance if Bill got in a jam without a local topographical map and with no GPS available on his older phone, this map would have been his go-to. With that in mind, if we zero in on the area surrounding where Bill was found, something very striking pops out. To some degree on the visitor map, but especially on the Harrison map, because of how the topography is drawn. Bill's route up the wash into the mountains appears to be the straightest and topographically most forgiving shot to Park Road from Smithwater Canyon or any point west of Smithwater Canyon. If Bill had this map, or the contemporaneous Nat Geo map of the park, the otherwise inexplicable decision to go straight up into the mountains instead of turning either way into Quail Wash makes perfect sense. To me, once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this is what happened, Bill's actions after that become even more clear. Missing the then nearly invisible and unmarked Mary Trail, Bill would have continued up the wash as it turned north and left it at the point it began to track back to the west, then bushwhacking up the slope at a right angle to clear the ridge and continue his eastward progress to the road. Tragically, he made it, but with the last obstacle overcome, he could go no further. There's one last bit of corroboration for this scenario. We know that just before the end, on the slope, Bill got out his binoculars. But why? He had little forward visibility going up the slope, so he could have only been looking behind him, where he would have had his first clear view of the surrounding landscape. The only logical reason for him to spend his last energy focusing his binoculars on the area he had just left, right after changing direction and where he had his first good view, would be to check the orientation of his map. So with this final deduction drawn from Bill's location, let's now turn to the theories we talked about in part 1 and see how they hold up, and if they don't, where that might lead us next. Since we can be pretty sure about the end of Bill's journey, we have to try to work backwards to figure out its mysterious middle. As we've already said several times, he had only 2 likely pathways into this area, through Smithwater Canyon from the west, and through an unnamed canyon that we will call Quail Wash Canyon, since it runs into Quail Wash from the south. This was the canyon and the wash we explored in part 1. At that time, I was going off the theory that Bill had been attempting to loop back to his car from Quail Mountain by bushwhacking east across the mountains to the southern end of Johnny Lane Canyon, then back through easy desert terrain to the parking lot. Under this theory, somehow Bill would have drifted into rough terrain to the north of this route and then gotten funneled further north up to Quail Wash. I liked this theory for a number of reasons. First, it put Bill on a loop that did not add extra distance to the return trip. It would have taken him to the southernmost tip of Johnny Lane Canyon, which was on his planned itinerary. It also puts him fairly close to some nasty terrain that could have gotten him hung up without requiring a long detour. That's my problem with a lot of other theories. So what's the problem with my theory? Well, first off, everything I told you before, the maps and Bill's route through the mountains, that only works if Bill came through Smithwater Canyon. This way, you can forget it. It makes no sense at all. Also, remember in part 1 when we stood at the canyon mouth and wondered if we'd go left or we'd go right? Well, that only makes sense if Bill wasn't sure where he was. If he knew, then the way out was obvious. Straight shot and easy terrain to Park Road on the right. That's why Tom and I are both fairly certain Bill didn't try to do a loop up and back through the full length of Johnny Lane Canyon, which would have taken him on basically the same route. Because if Bill knew enough to navigate that loop, he'd know where Park Road was. No question. I also don't think he had enough time, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, the Quail Wash Canyon route and the subsequent choice to turn left away from Park Road that we talked about in part 1, that only makes sense if he didn't originally intend to go this way. But there are other problems with this theory too. First off, it requires Bill to have made it to the top of Quail Mountain, but his name was not found on the register. Second, Bill still would have needed to stray north fairly early on to get into trouble, and there's just no obvious reason for him to do that. There's also a problem with the cell phone ping location. The splash map shows coverage all through the northern mouth of the canyon. Only the northernmost edge of that coverage area is close enough to the 10.6 mile radius to fit the ping location. So it means that Bill would have had to wait quite a while after leaving the canyon to fire up his phone, or else the distance from the tower would have been greater. Basically, it's just barely possible for the ping to be from this route. The other locations fit much better. So can we rule this theory out? Not completely, but it only works if Bill didn't know where he was. In that case, the left turn at the canyon mouth and the following the wash that we saw in part 1, that would all still make sense. But given the short distances involved and the fact that he probably had a map and compass, that would be hard to understand. And honestly, the other evidence doesn't seem to be a good fit for this scenario. Therefore, I no longer think this is what happened. For me, seeing how much Bill's path, while it doesn't make much sense from the ground, makes lots of sense on the map, is conclusive. And that navigational logic only holds if Bill came from the west. I now agree with Tom Mahood that Bill must have come through Smithwater Canyon. And that brings us to Tom Mahood's old theory. With over 50 searches for Bill Ewasko under his belt, Tom Mahood knows the terrain of the region better than anyone. It's long been Tom's belief that Bill wound up in Smithwater Canyon, with his theory being that Bill ran out of water on the ascent to Quail Mountain and was tempted by seemingly easy terrain, though in reality it's anything but, to strike out for Smithwater Canyon and an active spring there. To be honest, I always had a lot of trouble with this theory, because striking out into unknown terrain away from one's car in the hopes of finding a spring on a hot summer desert day would be a frankly insane and reckless course of action. As a Georgia resident with only a vague sense of California drought conditions, Bill could not even be sure the spring wasn't dry. It would have been far safer and probably faster to just wait under a bush for things to cool off and then hike back to the car at dusk. However, in Tom's defense, this theory has stood for so long simply because no one can come up with any better reason for Bill to keep going north of Quail Mountain to the Smithwater Canyon area. Given the distance from his car and his late start, it's simply inexplicable. As we have just seen, we now know that Bill probably did wind up in Smithwater Canyon, but that he also had an adequate supply of water, which blows out the idea of Bill heading north to look for some. However, to me, this actually makes Tom's theory of a loop through Smithwater Canyon somewhat more plausible. We know from notes found at his condo, Bill was interested in going there, and if he had a reasonable amount of water, he could strike out in hopes of finding the spring, but if he didn't, he might still be able to make it back without, albeit he'd be pretty thirsty when he did. We also know that Bill didn't sign the register at Quail Mountain, implying he didn't make it all the way there, and the best route to Smithwater Canyon starts on the ridge a short distance before the mountain summit. Bill would only have to bushwhack to the western mouth of Smithwater, at which point he could take the California riding and hiking trail all the way back to his car. Now, as I just said, I do now believe Bill did indeed wind up in Smithwater Canyon. That being said, even with the water run out of the equation, I still can't quite buy this scenario because of the timeline. Remember, we know Bill arrived at the parking lot no earlier than 10:40 a.m., and so the best possible speed to the top of Quail Mountain would have him there at 1:30 p.m. The jumping off point to Smithwater Canyon would be a little before that, so let's say Bill gets there at 1 p.m. So let's now put ourselves in Bill's shoes at that moment, thinking over whether this is a good idea. From that point, a loop up to Smithwater Canyon and back is going to add 8 miles to his return trip, making a total of 14 miles back to his car. Let's assume a wildly optimistic average pace of 2 miles an hour. That would put Bill back at his car at 8 p.m., exactly at sundown. Bill would then need to get dinner. It's 43 minutes to his original dinner destination, Pappy and Harriet's, which would probably still be open and on the way. So if Bill jumps right in his car and goes, that puts us to 8:45 p.m. 45 minutes to eat and an hour back to his condo puts Bill home at 10:30 p.m. and in bed by 11:30, ready for another day of adventures. Works out perfectly, right? Except there's absolutely no way this would ever happen, and Bill would know that. First off, 1 p.m. is the earliest possible time Bill could have gotten to this point. It was almost certainly later, and if Bill had stopped off at Lost Horse Mine beforehand, it might have been substantially later. Next, even factoring in the last 4.5 miles on a flat abandoned road, and assuming the terrain to Smithwater was as good as it appeared, and trust me, it's not, a 2 miles per hour average would be wildly unrealistic, and as an experienced hiker, Bill would know that too. Moreover, this is assuming a forced march in mid-afternoon on a hot desert day with no brakes. If Bill looked around for water at the spring or got hung up for any reason, that would add additional time. Even the amount of time it would take for Bill to think all this stuff over would wreck this timeline. While you can make a best case scenario where this trip barely pencils out, in the real world there simply was not enough time for Bill to do this loop. And once again, as an experienced hiker, he'd know that. Furthermore, although we know Bill was interested in Smithwater Canyon from a list found at his condo, it's mentioned there together with another location, Covington Flats. And this is totally logical because from Lower Covington Flats trailhead, it's an easy 1-mile walk to the head of Smithwater Canyon. There was simply no reason for Bill to do a dangerous bushwhack to Smithwater Canyon when he could just come back the next day, drive to Covington, and walk there in 20 minutes. Their being mentioned together in the report suggests that that's probably what Bill had considered doing. But significantly, it wasn't on the itinerary Bill carried with him in his car. But you know what was on that itinerary? Quail Mountain. And at the point where Bill would have headed for Smithwater Canyon, Bill would have been 95% of the way to the mountain's summit. So if Bill got that far, instead of abandoning that goal for some crazy cross-country bushwhack to a place he could reach on an easy hike some other time, why not just finish the job, sign the register, and go back and enjoy a well-earned dinner at the proper time? Remember, because there is ample cell reception between Quail Mountain and Smithwater Canyon, Bill can't have just made a short jog north from the trail and gotten injured and not be able to come back. For this to work, it requires Bill to have traversed all the way to the cell dead zone on the south side of Smithwater Canyon. Now, as Tom and I can both testify, the terrain there sucks. If Bill tried this loop under these circumstances, an injury would be highly likely. But as we've already seen, the timeline just does not seem to fit the scenario, either coming or going. So can we rule this theory out? No, not completely. Bill had to get to Smithwater Canyon somehow, and if Bill didn't go this way and he didn't go the other way, that leaves us with only the California Riding and Hiking Trail. But if Bill, for whatever reason, went too far on that trail, all he had to do is turn around and go back on the same trail. Basically, as I said before, the decision to move north from Quail Mountain, regardless of the route or the reason, is simply inexplicable, as is the 2.5-day gap in the timeline until Bill appears at the eastern mouth of Smithwater Canyon, making a beeline for Park Road and nearly making it. We found Bill's remains, but the basic questions that surrounded how and why he disappeared are just as baffling as they ever were. Even though they represent the two most likely scenarios to explain this fact set, both my and Tom's old theories rested on assumptions that don't seem to fit Bill's likely actions or the scant evidence that we have. So, what if none of it ever happened? Everything we know suggests that Bill was planning a simple out-and-back day hike. What if that's exactly what he attempted to do? What if he never moved past Quail Mountain or even tried to climb it? What if Bill was never stuck in one spot for 2 days? Is there a plausible scenario where Bill just tried to do what he said he was going to do, taking no crazy chances or ambitious detours, and yet somehow wound up far from any logical day hike route in a different part of the park? There just might be one, and that's what we'll discuss next. Some time after I visited the site where Bill was found, after I returned to Asia, I had an exchange with Reddit user Indy Jason, who suggested that Bill might have gotten lost on the Stubby Springs Loop, which is a spur trail that runs south from Bill's presumed route to Quail Mountain. This actually was an old theory of mine, and before that, some of the original search parties, but now that Bill had been found, I initially dismissed this as crazy. After all, a wrong turn down Stubby Springs is about as far from Bill's remains as you could get, heading in the exact opposite direction. But I started thinking about what would happen to Bill if he got lost on the Stubby Springs Loop, and I suddenly realized a whole chain of events would flow from that might put him exactly where he wound up. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The main question, as always, was how Bill would have gotten lost in the first place, but as I went deeper down the rabbit hole, I found some answers, both in my previous experience in the area that you saw in episode 36 and in the research for this very show. To examine this theory, first I must ask you to basically forget all the information I just threw at you for the last 25 minutes, except where Bill wound up, the navigational logic that got him there, and the things we know for certain from the timeline. Let's further assume that Bill had planned to do exactly what he said he had planned to do. And from that baseline, let's start all over fresh and walk through the timeline from the very beginning, and with these assumptions, see if we can find a scenario that fits the facts. We start at Thursday morning at 7. Bill calls the owner of his rented condo and says he's underway. The next call is to his fiancée at 8, and he tells her that he's on his way to the park. But we know at that point he was on I-10 in the Thousand Palms area, which is still not far from his condo. So it's a safe assumption that the time between 7 and 8, Bill spent getting breakfast. This is important because after this we have a gap in our timeline and we know that he wasn't eating. If Bill had driven straight to where his car was found, he would have gotten there at 9:15, but another hiker arrives at the same location at 10:20 and doesn't see his car. This is how we know he could not have started before 10:40. We know he wasn't at breakfast, so where was he? Well, let's look at the itinerary he left with his fiancée. It lists Carey's Castle first, Lost Horse Mountain second, Quail Mountain third. We know he discussed Carey's Castle with his fiancée on that 8 a.m. phone call, and she discouraged him from going. This area was checked early on in the search and appeared to not have been visited for a long time. We know Bill's car was found at Juniper Flats trailhead, which is the trailhead to Quail Mountain. So, logic dictates that in between he went to Lost Horse Mountain, and there's some major corroboration from a second itinerary rangers found at his condo. It mentions for his Thursday schedule Lost Horse Mountain again, but does not mention the other two destinations, so Lost Horse seems to have been his major goal for the day. Based on this and the gap in the timeline, it's a very safe bet that Bill went to Lost Horse first, and the trailhead is only a few miles south of where his car was found. So that would put Bill at Lost Horse Trailhead at 9:15 a.m. What next? Well, there are two major trails at Lost Horse, the shorter Lost Horse Mine Trail and the longer Lost Horse Mountain Trail. Which one did Bill take? Well, both itineraries explicitly state Lost Horse Mountain, the longer trail. That loop is 6.7 miles long with an estimated hiking time of 3 hours. So if we weren't trying to make our timelines fit a presumed climb of Quail Mountain, it would be a safe assumption that Bill did indeed go to Lost Horse Mountain first and took the loop. So let's assume that he did. That finishes his hike at Lost Horse Mountain at around 12:15, which gives him all afternoon to try for his second destination, Quail Mountain. So let's give him 30 minutes to pack up, drive the 2 miles to Juniper Flats Trailhead, and get underway for that. Now, back in episode 36, I retraced what is assumed to be Bill's last known route, based on footprints that were seen by the hiker that first observed Bill's car on Thursday afternoon. That was walking the abandoned Juniper Flats Road from the trailhead to Juniper Flats, the location, which is a large flat expanse that sits just south of Quail Mountain. In reviewing the video logs, I can see that it took me exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes to get from the trailhead to Juniper Flats, the location, under very similar conditions to Bill's. So, using those numbers, that puts Bill at Juniper Flats, the location, at 3 p.m. And again, I want to acknowledge this is much later than all the timelines I threw at you before, which were all theoretical and based on trying to get Bill further up the mountain. I submit that under this scenario, this timeline is the most realistic. And now I'm going to arbitrarily add 1 more hour to this timeline, so let me explain why. First off, we have barely allowed any time for rest, meal breaks, or deviations from the trail. But moreover, searchers found a bandana about 0.8 of a mile north of this point on a route up Quail Mountain that would have shortly wound up in a dead end. We know that Bill was prone to wear bandanas, and I want to account for the possibility that Bill got that far. If he did, it makes sense that he would have abandoned his attempt to climb Quail Mountain a short time after that, since he would have seen that his route wasn't tenable and he no longer had enough time to reroute and make the ascent. It would have taken him about an hour to go this far and return to Juniper Flats, so 4 p.m. Either way, I think it's more realistic to assume that it was around 4 when Bill would have been at Juniper Flats ready to return. At the same time, I don't think it was much later than that because he had promised to call his fiancée on his exit, and he would know that it would be at least 2 hours from that point back to his car, so he was already more than an hour late for his planned 5 p.m. exit from the park at that point. This incidentally is very similar to the situation that I was in the same spot when I visited in May 2020. At any rate, under this scenario, it's at this point when Bill is getting ready to go back to his car that things went south. Though I'll do my best to break down this sequence of events step by step, I apologize, it is complicated and difficult to simplify. In researching this episode, I found at least one trail guide suggesting that the Quail Mountain Loop could be done in as little as 5 hours. So unlike the extended Smithwater Canyon Loop that we talked about earlier, it's plausible to me that, even with such a late start, Bill would think that he might have time to squeeze in the second hike. He'd be a little late getting out of the park, but not too bad if he hustled.
The problem is that even though the route Bill took to Juniper Flat is a flat, abandoned road, it's surfaced with deep sand and it's difficult to make good time. Trust me, I know. It also gives the impression you have gone farther than you think you have, since when I walked the same road, I thought I had made a steady 3 miles an hour to Juniper Flats, but the video log clearly shows I made a little over 2. The route is also hot and exposed with little shade, so even though from a map it looks like you might be able to make good time, on the ground it's a slog. Now, it's important to understand that there are 2 routes from the trailhead parking lot to the actual place called Juniper Flats. The southern path, which is the one we believe Bill went on and that I walked in episode 36, is the closed Jeep trail that dead ends at the flat. The other is a section of the 37-mile California riding and hiking trail, which is a footpath that parallels the old road to the north. So, under this scenario, it's about 4 p.m. Bill is preparing to go back to his car, having just failed at his main objective to climb Quail Mountain, and was looking at a late return trudging over the same hot and sandy old Jeep trail he'd come in on. And it's also worth mentioning that at this point in my own hike to the area, I was already exhibiting signs of being affected by the heat, slurring some words as I tried to narrate for the show.
He could have taken the Stubby Springs loop back.
Under these circumstances, with there being another trail of about the same length back to his car, Bill would get the consolation prize of a change of scenery and, if the trail was on firmer ground, possibly make up some lost time. So, it's very logical to assume that under this scenario, Bill would try his luck going back on the riding and hiking trail. And in fact, that would have been a very good decision, as it's reportedly a pleasant and cooler walk. However, when I was here in episode 36, even though I was intimately familiar with the area from studying the case, on my first time physically there, it was around this point I became confused and doubtful about where I actually was.
Given the amount of time I've been hiking and the distance I've been going, I'm starting to think that I'm on the wrong trail, because even though I've never been in this area before, I've studied it to the point where I thought I had the map memorized.
The walk to Juniper Flats took much longer than I expected, a key turnoff was unmarked, and most perplexing of all, the Jeep Trail was signed as the California Riding and Hiking Trail, which on maps is the other footpath to the north. Whether this is a mistake or a recent realignment of the trail not reflected on maps, I do not know, but it had me calling my entire understanding of the area into question. Now, let's be clear, these signs are new and post-date Bill's hike. We don't know for sure what signs existed in Bill's time, but we can be sure there weren't many. Even if there was not the same confusion over which path was the California Riding and Hiking Trail, if not, it's unlikely that the Jeep Trail had any signage of its own to distinguish itself from the other path. So is it possible then that Bill, like I briefly did, was confused as to which trail he was on? To answer this question, I went back to the maps Bill would have had available in 2010, and I found something that shocked me. The Jeep Trail that leaves from the parking lot, which we assume Bill took from the footprint evidence, was not shown on any of the large-scale maps. The park map, the 2010 Tom Harrison map, and the Nat Geo map all show only the California Riding and Hiking Trail leading away from the parking lot. In actuality, the trail runs slightly north of the parking lot and is inconspicuous even now compared to the obvious Jeep Trail that does exit the lot. Only the Keys View topographical map shows both routes accurately, but with the Jeep Trail marked as private, it implies that it is closed to the public. With an obvious trail leading from the parking lot, there would have been no need for Bill to get out the bulkier, more detailed topographical map. With the California Riding and Hiking Trail being the only route shown leaving from the parking lot on all 3 of the available large-scale maps, it's highly plausible that Bill thought that's what he was on. The 2 routes have roughly the same distance, roughly the same path, and have the same number of trail connections. And when Bill got to Juniper Flats, he could easily fail to note or attach any importance to the actual California Riding Hiking Trail, which was and is still unmarked at its intersection with the Jeep Trail. So, back to our timeline. If Bill was at Juniper Flats ready to return at around 4, he would have known he was already running late for an expected check-in with his fiancée and his stated 5 p.m. exit from the park. He would also know it would be more than 2 hours returning on the route he came in on. Under these circumstances, could he have taken a moment to look for another way back? If at this moment he got out the more detailed Keys View topographical map, which we have some evidence he had, he would now see both of the routes from the parking lot area to where he was. He would also see that it was the northern path that corresponded to whatever other maps he had. That would make him believe he had a southern loop back to his car on a better defined and possibly faster old road, not realizing that was the road he was already on. So, under that incorrect reading of the map, Bill would be leaving Juniper Flat and passing the unmarked riding and hiking trail intersection once again, and then would be looking for a loop back at a Y intersection with a well-defined old Jeep trail continuing on his right. And very shortly, he would find exactly that, the intersection with the Stubby Springs Loop Trail. Now, one thing we know is that in 2010, the Stubby Springs Loop Trail was marked, but crucially, it was marked at a newly made four-way intersection a few meters past the Y junction. If Bill simply took the old Jeep trail at the Y that he was already watching out for and expecting, he would never have seen the sign. The junction with the Stubby Springs Trail shown on the maps he had would bear no resemblance to what he was seeing. Everything would align with the assumption that he was returning on the southern route to the parking lot when in fact he'd already been on it all afternoon. There are so many trails converging so close together at this point, and they are still so confusingly marked. And the two old Jeep trails are so much more obvious than the smaller footpaths around them that if Bill was already biased towards thinking he was on a different trail and not at his sharpest, this mistake is not a stretch to me at all. So if this is what happened, Bill now begins tracking towards the south, thinking he is heading back to his car on what is a well-defined old road that's more pleasant and scenic than the one he's been on. The setting sun would still be reassuringly on his right, and being that he was likely focused on making good time and probably slightly impaired at this point, the subtle change in direction would likely go unnoticed for some time. Most man-made disasters don't spring from one bad decision, but from a series of small, understandable mistakes that build on one another. And from this point, a lot of things could have gone very wrong. Bill could have gotten sidetracked into a side wash fairly early on, as I theorized in 2014, but on this timeline, I think he would have had enough daylight to see that he was heading west towards sundown and backtrack back out. A little further south, though, the old Jeep Trail, and with it the Stubby Springs Trail, merge into a wash. Mark that point. Continuing further south, shortly before reaching Stubby Springs at about 1.3 miles from the junction with Juniper Flats Road, the wash merges with a larger wash at a sharp angle. At this point, the Stubby Springs Trail emerges on the opposite side going up a hill. Significantly, aerial photographs taken in June 2011 show rocks marking the path across the wash, but in 2009, though it's hard to tell with a low resolution, those rocks do not appear to be there. Assuming they were placed there after Bill disappeared, this is another likely spot for Bill to have lost the trail, although again, it would probably be early enough for him to backtrack and recover, but he would lose valuable time in rapidly diminishing light. A short distance further south, the trail reaches Stubby Springs, which was likely signed at that time, and the trail makes a sharp left turn. If Bill did not get sidetracked along the way, under our timeline, it would now be about 5:30 p.m. If he did, it would be significantly later. Whatever time it was, it's at this point that Bill should have realized he was in the wrong place. He would have been forced to stop and get out his compass and whatever maps he had to assess the situation. He would not have liked what he saw. He had walked to a remote corner of the park a mile and a half out of his way. The Keys View map would not show the path of the Stubby Springs Trail after this point, but the Harrison map did show the route and would give him the distances to roughly compare his two options, continue on or backtrack. If he continued on the Stubby Springs loop, he would eventually arrive back at Juniper Flats Road and then back to his car. The distances back would have appeared roughly the same between the two options, with backtracking being slightly shorter. We know he didn't do that because if he did, he would have made it back to his car. It may be that with the distances nearly equal, Bill preferred not to go back on the long sandy inbound trail and hoped he'd see something new and maybe make better time on a smaller but firmer trail. He might also have tried to bushwhack a trail cutoff to create a more direct third option, similar to what we believe he did 3 days later. Whatever the reason, one thing is known: the Stubby Springs Loop Trail becomes much harder to follow from this point on. Trail blogs use words like faint and describe multiple tricky wash crossings. Moreover, the original incident reports state that even the search and rescue teams had to be recalled from this trail because they could no longer follow it after dark. Whether he tried to take the trail as it was or do the bushwhack cutoff option, Bill would have made slow progress, and the darker it got, the more pressure he would have felt and the harder it would be to distinguish the trail, see topographical landmarks, and navigate across the washes. Whether Bill actually got lost or realized he was likely to soon become lost, probably by 7 p.m., Bill would have decided continuing on the loop trail was not tenable. We know he probably had an LED light with his survival whistle, but it's unlikely he carried a flashlight. So the later it got, the worse it was for Bill, and we can assume whether it was coming or going, at some point he lost the trail, his bearings, or both. His only remaining option at that point would be to try to return to the better defined section of the trail north of Stubby Springs. He would still have his compass and he could dead reckon west, hoping to intersect it on its north-south track. The problem then would be whether he walked overland or traversed west via the large intersecting wash we discussed earlier. Once dusk arrived, he likely would have been unable to distinguish the trail from any of the other washes or desert landscape in the region. He could not be sure under this scenario if he'd gone too far west or not far enough, and he could have expended endless amounts of time in the dark trying to figure that out. Furthermore, because of the topography of the area, if he did not know how far east or west he was, he would not be able to use his compass to dead reckon north back to the main road to his car. And once night deepened, in a remote area with significant rattlesnake and mountain lion activity and limited light, that would not have been an attractive option anyway. The only paths of nighttime travel would then become the dry washes. Now, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that I just spun a very specific, detailed narrative from speculation piled on speculation piled on speculation. But whether the time was this or that, whether Bill zigged or zagged, whatever variables you want to plug into this scenario, I now believe that the most plausible explanation for what happened to Bill is what I just told you. And here's why. For Bill to wind up where he did and how he did, at some point he had to make an affirmative decision to move north away from his car. I've spent the last half an hour explaining why the three most obvious routes don't seem to make sense. That leaves only one other pathway into the area, the large north-south wash to the west that empties into Covington Flats. And the only way that Bill goes there is if Bill takes the Stubby Springs Loop. Furthermore, the only way Bill gets to Covington Wash is if he gets lost between the wash and the Stubby Springs Trail without being able to navigate back. With a map and a compass and a fatigued but sound body and mind, that only happens to Bill if he gets confused and delayed enough that daylight slips away from him. Once he's lost, he can only navigate west, and if he misses the trail, the Covington Wash becomes literally Bill's only option. All the topography and all the washes in the area flow to it. If he finds his way there at night, it will be his only viable path of travel. At daybreak, it will be the most obvious corridor or identifiable landmark for miles around. On his map, it will be clear as day. Even if Bill, in daylight, finds his bearings at that point, following the wide and easily navigable wash will look like a better and faster option than spending more time backtracking his way to the trail. And with this, at last, we finally have a plausible reason for Bill to decide to head north. And nowhere along his ensuing path of travel will there be any hint of Verizon cell reception. If this is what happened, once Bill gets to Covington Wash, the rest of the story is easy to deduce. It would be a hot, winding uphill 4-mile slog in the wash, but with its wide and mostly unobstructed path, Bill probably would have made it to the California Riding and Hiking Trail sometime late Friday morning. Even though Bill likely would have known that that was the trail back to his car, it was now more than 9 miles away through rugged terrain. However, to the north, he was only 2.5 miles through mostly flat landscape to a drive-in trailhead at Upper Covington Flat. Exhausted and with his food and water likely nearly gone, it's easy to see why Bill would have continued north, hoping to find help at the nearby trailhead. Unfortunately, as I can attest from multiple trips there, this is a remote, sparsely visited location. At the height of summer, Bill would have found nobody and nothing there but an unsheltered tiny parking lot square in the middle of a vast, unshaded, and roasting hot expanse of desert. He would not have stayed long. The next logical step would be to traverse the much cooler canyon to the east, making the short hop to another nearby trailhead at Lower Covington Flat, stopping on the way to check if the spring shown on the map was still dry. It was. Arriving at Lower Covington Trailhead, he would have once again found no one. but at least it would be a more comfortable and sheltered area to spend Friday night hoping for rescue. But at this juncture, rangers had yet to find Bill's car. They would not arrive here to search for him until Sunday morning. After waking up Saturday and probably waiting a few hours for someone to show up, Bill would have had only one move left. With Saturday morning now past, Bill would know any drive-in visitation to the area would be unlikely to happen soon. Since the road north would be a 7-mile unsheltered walk to the nearest house, the remaining move was a no-brainer. As I said earlier, it's an easy 20-minute walk from this point to the mouth of Smithwater Canyon. From there, Bill's map would show him a straight shot through the canyon less than 5 miles to Park Road and certain rescue. We don't know if he knew about the active spring in the canyon or not, but even if he didn't, the name of the place hints that there might be one. The chance of getting water along the most direct route to certain rescue made this by far the best option for Bill to save himself. And now we have a plausible reason for Bill to go into Smithwater. So, sometime during the day Saturday, Bill would have started working his way northeast through Smithwater Canyon. In his weakened state and with some substantial obstructions, including a tricky dry waterfall, it would have been slow going. Here, Tom Mahood makes a fair point against this whole scenario. Tom observes that if Bill had gone down Smithwater in this manner, he would have certainly found the spring, gotten water, and made it out alive. I'm not sure that this is necessarily true. Though 2010 was not a drought year, I can't verify that there would have been water in the spring at the height of summer. All the pictures I can locate of it online, mostly in hiking blogs, were taken in the winter. Even if Bill did find water, the location of his remains at the top of a long, desperate struggle up a steep ridge after a several miles uphill slog in direct sunlight suggests Bill may have died from exhaustion, heat stroke, or a cardiac event. Unfortunately, there are many different ways the desert can kill you. Bill would have spent his last night somewhere at the eastern mouth of the canyon, perhaps under a rock shelter like this one that I found in the area. At dawn, he got underway again, and finally clearing the high walls of Smithwater and entering Quail Wash, he would have fired up his cell for one more try. For the first time since his ordeal started, he would have briefly connected to a tower. Had he turned north up Quail Wash at that point, in about a mile he would have been able to call for help. But Bill couldn't know that, and instead he continued his determined march in a straight line into the mountains towards Park Road, up to the point where he could go no further. If this is what happened, not counting his earlier hike at Lost Horse, Bill would have walked nearly 30 miles in the desert sun in his quest to return to his loved ones, before tragically meeting his end just 1 mile from rescue. From the time Bill vanished, the puzzle of what happened captivated Tom Mahood's imagination and inspired him to spend countless hours searching and researching, trying to solve the riddle. By sharing his information online, he inspired me and many others to invest themselves in the mystery, and in some cases, like mine, to become actively involved in the search. But along the way, though we cared deeply about what happened to Bill, we didn't know him. Unfortunately, at times some of us misjudged him, suspecting he might be a greenhorn idiot who didn't take enough water into the California desert, or a duplicitous fraud who staged his own disappearance. But his friends who did know him called him a bull of a man, and someone who would not stop until he dropped. And they were right. Tom Mahood was also right when he said he believed Bill was smart, fit, capable, and had a plan. For my own part, in misjudging Bill, I can only say I was trying to honestly go wherever the evidence and logic took me on this strange case. But I, like everyone else, was functioning on an incomplete set of facts. We still are, and unless new evidence is found, we will never know for absolute certain the exact chain of events for those 3 days. But having been to the scene and re-examined all of the possibilities one more time, it's that same commitment to facts, logic, and plausibility that now lead me to conclude that this is the most likely explanation for what happened to Bill. While it's mostly speculative, and many other things might have happened, this is the only scenario that to me offers a series of plausible actions consistent with Bill's known plans, the lay of the land, the cell phone reception patterns, and the timeline. It doesn't require Bill to do anything stupid or suddenly recover from a serious injury or health event. He just made a few small mistakes, no worse than any other day hiker, including me, have made at some time or another in our lives. As someone who previously reached those wrong conclusions, it was a moral obligation for me to make this video. I don't regret them, as all of those earlier theories and searches, along with Tom Mahood and others gracefully sharing information with me, allowed me to piece together this puzzle and now tell what I think is the truest story we can tell. Regardless of how he got there, there is no doubt in my mind that Bill Ewasko's last hours were spent on a gutsy and determined push to rescue himself, and he almost pulled it off. Bill, you were a hell of a man. It's been my honor to search for you, to share with people what you did, and to finally know you.
And if I spend my life wandering in circles, conjuring better things, I was dreaming of home. Speaking of dreams though, weren't you just with me? How did I get here? Blinking in sunlight, saguaro and sand.